I'm just giving you slight examples. There's many, many more of what was happening that completely flies in the face of the characterization that there was nothing but peace between Muslims and Christians until those pesky Crusaders came along. Okay. And then, so let's fast forward some more.
All right, Raymond. So the thing I'd love to have you do is to provide some context for folks out there, because I think what's taken place in a lot of the history books and the way history is taught is that somehow these crusades kind of launched out of these Christian crusades, launched out of nowhere to go back and conquer the Holy Land, where the opposite is actually true. There had been hundreds of years of jihad waged against Christendom, not only in the ancient cities of where Christianity originated, but making its way all the way up into Europe. So would you provide a little context as to the magnitude and the savagery that was involved in those initiatives?
Absolutely, David. And you hit on the most important point when it comes to the Crusades, which is that they're always presented nowadays in a vacuum. In other words, and I'll give you a perfect example. I've almost memorized this quote from a Georgetown professor, where I actually went before over 20 years ago. His name is John Esposito, and he's supposed to be an expert on Islamic history, et cetera, read many books. He's a consultant for, intelligence departments, FBI, CIA, military, Pentagon. And in one of his books, I'm slightly paraphrasing it, but it's almost verbatim. He says something like 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed between Christians and Muslims before an imperial papal power play led to centuries of so-called holy wars that have left an enduring legacy of mistrust and resentment from Muslims to Christians. Okay. So what he's saying is that right before the first crusade was called in 1095, you had nothing but pure peace between Muslims and Christians. Okay. So obviously, if you believe that, and as you can see, that's what they peddle. The Crusades, the first crusade at least, is going to come off as a completely unwarranted offensive campaign against peaceful Muslims. All right. So what really happened? Okay, now let's go back. He mentioned the 5 centuries, which essentially is going way back to the time of Muhammad was born. But basically, by the time Muhammad dies and the Arabian Peninsula is consolidated under Islamic rule, and the first and second and third caliphs, etc., you have what's known in history as the Great Arab Conquests, where they spread out and conquer. Now, most people, again, because this is part of the spin, don't realize that the lands that they conquered, the lands that we know today in North Africa and the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Iraq, and of course, Egypt and Libya and Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, all of that was not just Christian. It was more Christian than Europe. That was really the heart of the Christian world at the dawn of Islam in the 7th century at the time of these Arab conquests that I'm referring to. And if you look at the sources, which I've done, the primary sources from both sides, Muslims and Christians, that are the contemporary earliest sources, it was essentially just mass destruction. And from the Muslim side, it's definitely described as a jihad. Okay, so they're conquering the infidel according to the principles that we know. You give the non-Muslim 3 choices: convert, or become you pay tribute, and you're a dhimmi and you're a second-class citizen, etc., or you fight to the death. Okay. So that's how it's definitely presented in the Islamic sources. And in the Christian sources, it's just seen as mass destruction and chaos and enslavement, massacres, destruction, ritual destruction of churches. And that's how you know, actually, even from the Christian side, because they still didn't know, this is very early, who these Muslims are and what they want. But it comes out in the sources that there's definitely an ideological component, because they were very much attacking crosses and churches and going out of their way to desecrate them. Sophrinus, the bishop of Jerusalem, who was actually living at the time around 637, actually says all this. So long story short, from a century after Muhammad's death, the traditional date being 632 AD, and now reached 732. And Islam has now conquered all of North Africa, those countries I mentioned, Egypt, Morocco, and all of the Middle East. It was known as Greater Syria. Greater Syria essentially encompassed those other countries, Lebanon and Israel, etc. And now they've conquered Spain, which we'll get into in the year 711. And now in 732, they're in the middle of France, where you have the famous Battle of Tours.
Wow.
The Battle of Poitiers. And Charles Martel, and it's known as an epic great victory. I have a whole chapter about it in one of my books, Sword and Scimitar, chapter 3, I think, because it is that pivotal and important.
That's my favorite one. I love that book.
Thank you. And, okay, so there it is. So I just mentioned that quote from John Esposito, 5 peaceful centuries had elapsed before those evil crusaders. And just in the first century, 3/4 of Christendom, the older, richer, more sophisticated, more important section was completely destroyed and annexed and Islamized. So apparently that's part of the 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, apparently. Okay. And we can get into a lot of details of what happened, but I'm going to try to fast forward. In the year 1009. So I'm already talking about, we ended at 732. Between 732 and the 11th century, you have now all the Mediterranean nations, islands get conquered. And it's the same thing. It's depredations. You have mass slavery going on, of the Berbers. The way the sources talk about it, it sounds like a mass slave campaign, especially. And then, so 1009, the reason I brought that up is, again, to underscore just what was happening before the First Crusade. And here you have a Fatimid Caliph, a Shia Caliph. People they forget that in Egypt was actually ruled by Shias for a couple of centuries, or even more, actually. And that even Al-Azhar, it's an ironic fact, Al-Azhar, this great bastion of Sunni learning, the greatest Islamic Sunni college in the entire world, was founded as a Shia school. And people don't realize
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I find that interesting. Anyway, that Caliph, Hakim Ba'amr Allah is his name. In 1009, according to Muslim sources, destroyed 30,000 churches in Egypt and Syria, Greater Syria, which once again emphasizes and shows you how Christian those regions were, and also gives you an idea of the sorts of persecution that was going on. Alongside the destruction of the churches was, again, persecution against Christians, as well as Jews, and all sorts of taxations, making them wear 10-pound crosses around their necks, and they have to ride donkeys backwards, and all sorts of humiliating injunctions and whatnot. So again, I'm just giving you slight examples. There's many, many more of what was happening that completely flies in the face of the characterization that there was nothing but peace between Muslims and Christians until those pesky crusaders came along. Okay. And then, so let's fast forward some more. Then around the middle of the 11th century, you have the rise of the Turks, specifically the Seljuk Turks, who were imported originally as slave soldiers. And they essentially take over the Abbasid Caliphate, and they keep the Caliph as a figurehead. And this goes on for a long time. But if you look at the sources at this time, we know about the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks around the 20th century and the late 19th century. But it really went on. It started 1,000 years earlier. Because if you look at the sources, and I'm specifically thinking of Matthew of Edessa, a contemporary, he basically documents how those Turks came rushing in from the east and entered Anatolia, or Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, and where you had a huge Armenian population. And the records just talk about the sack and destruction and massacre of tens of thousands of Christians, and the enslavement of even more, and the ritual desecration and destruction of churches and crosses. So just in one city, Ani, which was the capital of Armenia at the time, this is maybe, I think, around 1065, the Muslim Turks, Seljuks, it was known as the city of 1,001 churches, and they ritually destroyed all 1,001 churches.
Oh my God!
And destroyed all the crucifixes except for one very large gilded cross, which they sent as a trophy of war to Baghdad. Once again, underscoring the ideological component that this wasn't just war between two groups, that this was literally a jihad against the infidel. So this is now going on, and then in the year 1071. About 6 years later, you have the famous Battle of Manzikert, also featured in my book, Sword and Scimitar, because it's a very decisive battle where the Turks defeat the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, as they call them. And after that, all resistance collapses in Asia Minor, and the Turks are running amok all the way westward through Asia Minor till they're essentially right across from Constantinople. Wow. And this is the background of the First Crusade. And at the same time, the Turks were also, because pilgrimage to the Holy Land had always gone on, and even after the initial Muslim conquest, Jerusalem was conquered in 637. Even at that point, pilgrimages continued, and most Muslim rulers were smart enough to allow it because they completely taxed and extorted the visiting Christians from Europe to come visit the holy sites in Jerusalem and elsewhere. And even then, they were attacked and killed by the populace, etc. But during the time I'm describing the rise of the Turks, it was extremely horrific. The abuses that the Turks were inflicting on European pilgrims. And one of them is actually very well known. It's around also, I think, the year 1065 when Ani was being sacked. And it's recorded in at least one well-documented source where you have an eyewitness talking about how it was a large German pilgrimage going to the Holy Land. And among them was she's described as a very beautiful, but a nun who was a very chaste nun. And, I think she's an abbess actually. And they took her and ritually ganked her in front of everyone until she died. Okay. And then the chronicler ends it by saying, and the Turks did these sorts of abuses all the time against our people. Such is the backdrop and the impetus and motivation for the First Crusade. So if you listen to what Pope Urban and Peter the Hermit and all the preachers of the First Crusade, this is what they were talking about. If you read the letters that the Emperor Alexius, Eastern Roman Emperor, sent to the West appealing for aid, that's what he described. Okay, what I just described. And even more, they talk about how they would go into the churches, the Turks, and split open people and tie their coal and wick them until they die. They would boys and throw them in baptismal fonts, etc., etc. At which point Pope Urban finally said, who's going to address and avenge and redress these wrongs? And which point the famous line Deus vult came out. God wills it, and all the Franks and Christians who heard it committed to the First Crusade. So that's what really was happening leading to the First Crusade, even though we are told, and most people think, that there was nothing but peaceful coexistence amongst Muslims and Christians until those evil, pesky Catholics decided to go and ruin it all.